Mr. Floyd would have died under these circumstances.
Objection, Your Honor, is the stated legal standard.
Overruled, this is not the legal standard, simply his diagnosis. We can go forward on that basis.
So I'll answer the question, Counselor. As I mentioned earlier, there were multiple people on these video calls, and at some point there was more than one person asking questions at a time. I don't normally think of things in the but-for paradigm. Perhaps that's a legal thing, but it's not normally how I think as a forensic pathologist. So what I clarified for the U.S. Attorney in the Federal Bureau of Investigation was my opinion as to what happened to Mr. Floyd, and that is he experienced a cardiopulmonary arrest in the context of law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression. It was the stress of that interaction that tipped him over the edge, given his underlying heart disease and his toxicological status. That was also clarified in a letter from the Hennepin County Attorney to the U.S. Attorney, I want to say within a few days of that meeting, because of the confusion around how that meeting was run and the way those questions were asked.
Fair enough. Thank you. Again, the labeling this death as a homicide, that is a medical determination that you made, correct?
Correct.
It is not the same standard as the legal standard. Agreed?
I don't even know what the legal standard is, but there are two different worlds.
Now, in terms of your, again, involvement in this case, you have actually testified twice in connection with other proceedings, right?
Yes.
Regarding the death of Mr. Floyd, right?
Yes.
And the first of those testimonies occurred 20th of August, 2020?
Yes.
You understand that those were transcribed and under oath, correct?
Correct.
And you have had an opportunity to review those transcripts?
I have.
All right. The first time you testified in connection with the death of Mr. Floyd, at any point do you recall saying that I have to defer to some other specialty?
I believe I said that multiple times.
The first time you testified or the second time you testified?
I recall it was much more frequent the second time. I don't recall how often it happened the first time, if at all.
In terms of the placement of Mr. Chauvin's knee, would that explain anatomically why Mr. Floyd, would that anatomically cut off Mr. Floyd's airway?
In my opinion, it would not.
Do you testify extensively about the significance of the coronary arteries and the heart disease?
I'm not sure what you mean by the word extensively, Counselor. If we need to pull out the transcript, we can. I'm not sure what the word extensively means in this context.
Okay. You talked about the issues surrounding Mr. Floyd's death involving his coronary arteries, right?
Again, I can't quote you the grand jury transcript, but if you'd like to pull it out, I'd be happy to refresh my memory.
Sure.
I'm almost certain it had to have come up.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor,
For what purpose?
to refresh his recollection as he requested?
Let's lay the foundation for refreshing first.
In this proceeding, did you testify about, do you recall testifying about how the coronary arteries work relevant to providing the heart with blood?
I'm almost certain that I would have. I can't imagine that I didn't, but I don't recall how extensively that took place without looking at the transcript again.
Would looking at the transcript refresh your recollection about your testimony in that connection? In connection with it? May I approach? Dates 44314. Page 26.
What date?
26. I was in the operator. Does that refresh your recollection about your testimony?
It does.
So what was the problem with the coronary arteries in this context?
I believe it's essentially the same answer I gave the jury earlier, which is because of the degree of narrowing of Mr. Floyd's coronary arteries, they have a limited ability to supply extra blood and oxygen to his heart muscle when he needs it. On top of that, he's got a larger heart than a man his stature would normally have because he's hypertensive, and so that heart is going to need more oxygen, which those coronaries have a limited ability to deliver.
And how do you think the introduction of methamphetamine to that scenario impacts?
Again, I can only give that a high-level answer as a forensic pathologist. I don't treat living people who have methamphetamine toxicity, but my understanding is methamphetamine is hard on the heart. It is going to increase heart rate. It's going to increase the work of the heart because it's a stimulant.
And in the circumstances of this particular case, in terms of a person with an enlarged heart, narrowing of the arteries, right? And how does the introduction of methamphetamine affect that?
And as I just said, it increases the heart rate, it increases the work of the heart. It's not something that I, as a forensic pathologist, would want to see in the blood of someone that has heart disease.
Did you describe it as a multifactorial process, the death of Mr. Floyd?
That certainly sounds like something I would have said, yes.
Okay. And then you testified a second time, correct?
To the federal grand jury?
Yes.
Yes, I did.
And that was in February of 2021?
Yes.
And ultimately, you deferred to experts far more extensively in that second testimony than the first, correct?
So the short answer to that is yes. The long answer is I believe I deferred to a pulmonologist repeatedly because there were so many questions about things like gradations of chest wall movement and would this, that, or the other thing impair a person's ability to breathe. And at some point, I clearly said, look, this is outside the scope of my expertise as a forensic pathologist. I think a pulmonologist would be better equipped to answer that question. I'm going to say I said the word pulmonologist at least a half dozen times in that testimony.
Do you recall deferring also to emergency medical doctors?
Again, it would depend on the context of the question, but I know I did reference emergency medicine doctors because some of the questions were like, when do you think Mr. Floyd really died?
How about cardiologists?
Yes, if the question was specific to an area that would clearly be a cardiologist's expertise, I'm quite sure I would have referred to them as well.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have nothing further.
Mr. Blackwell.
Dr. Baker, I'm going to be brief. So if we could look up, Brett, the section on cause of death. So, Dr. Baker, take into account the entire exchange you had with Mr. Nelson on Mr. Floyd's medical conditions, on whatever testimony you gave, wherever you gave it. I want to bring our attention back to what's reflected in Exhibit 193. And taking all of that into account, what today remains your opinion as to the cause of death for Mr. Floyd.
So my opinion remains unchanged. It's what I put on the death certificate last June. That's cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement subdual restraint, and neck compression. That was my top line then. It would stay my top line now.
And so if we look at the other contributing conditions, those other contributing conditions are not conditions that you consider direct causes. Is that true?
They are not direct causes of Mr. Floyd's death. That's true. They're contributing causes.
And in terms of manner of death, you found then, and do you stand by today, that the manner of death for Mr. Floyd was, as you would call it, homicide?
Yes, I would still classify it as a homicide today.
Thank you, Dr. Baker. No further questions.
Anything further? Counsel, sidebar. Sometimes old-fashioned sign language is best. We're going to take a 15-minute break.